The words came through my phone like ice water. "We're not running a charity here. I'm Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, and this is my story from Ohio. From a beige apartment with 2 mugs in the sink and a stack of folded coupons on the kitchen table, to a yellow bedroom I never expected to call home. If you're watching from Ohio, or you've ever had to choose between what you've given and who gives you back, leave a note below. I want to know where you're watching from. When you hear we're not running a charity, it lands in a particular place inside you if you've been the one doing the giving for most of a life. It landed in mine the way a winter draft finds a loose window pane. Slow at first, then a cold that travels through every room. I was married to Richard for 35 years. He was an electrical engineer who could make a toaster behave like a symphony. He died 8 months ago, after a short, terrible fight with pancreatic cancer. Those 8 months pulled everything out from under me. The rhythm of Sunday mornings, the small jokes at dinner, the habit of 2 pairs of slippers by the back door. They also pulled apart the checks we had written for years and showed me what the sums underneath them really meant. We were never rich. We were careful. We clipped coupons. We bought in bulk when it made sense. We drove cars until the paint came off. When our children were little, Richard and I sat at our kitchen table once a month and decided what we could afford to give and what we needed to save. I know the numbers because I balanced those checkbooks. I wrote the dates on the backs of envelopes. I watched one by one, over decades, our money move toward the futures of the people we loved. I paid for David's first year at Ohio State, $43,000 all told, counting room, board, and a semester abroad he begged for. I loaned a young entrepreneur friend of David's $60,000 to get his welding business off the ground. That company is still running, and David's voice at the time was a thing of bright ambition. Jennifer needed $28,000 for her nursing degree when a scholarship fell through. I remember the night she called crying, and I couldn't sleep until it was arranged. Over the years, I gave $100,000 in smaller gifts, weddings, emergency loans, quiet support for times I thought were temporary holes someone would climb out of. We did these things because we could, and because we thought that was the point, to use what we had to make room for those we loved. That was the promise Richard and I made to each other, quietly, in the corner of the kitchen where the light fell soft on the bills. We did not imagine that those gifts would become a ledger against me, a tally to be inspected and judged later. When Richard got sick, the bills began to look like cliffs. 8 months of hospital rooms and chemotherapy, and hospital parking and the quiet patient bargaining with doctors and machines cost us $240,000 that I can still taste if I think too hard about it. Life insurance covered a portion, and selling the house finally paid the rest. After everything was settled, the medical bills, the funeral expenses, the small debts that collect like dust, there was a number left. I won't pretend it wasn't a shock. $470,000. It was there, suddenly, like an extra room that had always been in the house, but one we had never opened. Money after grief is a strange thing. It doesn't fix the holes. If anything, it makes them echo. The apartment felt bigger with Richard gone. There were empty evenings when the clock's small ticks felt like someone tapping a staccato finger on the windowsill. The extra money was not a comfort for that. It was practical, and it was real, and it was mine to decide about. But I began to see how it read differently to different people. David called the week after we closed on the sale. He sounded bright. There was a hum of something expensive in the background when he talked, like an air conditioner in a big house, or the echo in a high-ceiling room. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked, and I could hear the distance in how he put the words. There was a new rhythm to his voice, one shaped by his life, a life that had not slowed the way mine had. He wanted the facts, the cold details. How much? Did it cover the bills? What was left? There was a speed and an efficiency to his questions that made them feel less like concern than inventory. Jennifer came by instead. She arrived with a casserole and a bag of groceries. She sat on the sofa and folded her hands as if she had an anchor in them, and she stayed. She made her tea and asked about details when she needed to, but mostly she listened. When she left that first afternoon, she took the empty vase from the coffee table and put it on her counter for me until I wanted it back. That small, practical kindness was the kind that travels well through grief. You learn something about people when you're suddenly able to divide pieces of your life differently. You learn who brings casseroles and who brings forms. You learn who calls once and who calls back. You learn, perhaps most painfully, where your presence was taken as an unlimited resource and where it was treasured. I saw the pattern early on with David. He had always been the sort of child who moved toward opportunities. Bright ideas, meetings, overseas trips. Once, when he was 22, he came to me with a business plan in hand and a sparkle I recognized from his father. He needed a starter loan. We were careful, but we gave. He repaid in installments and then not at all. I didn't keep track of the accounting emotionally. It felt like supporting a child. We do that. That was our role. There were times I stayed up late worrying about loans he took and friendships he kept, but I thought, as most mothers do, that love would catch him the way it always had. After Richard died, I began to organize things. I called Tom Walsh, our lawyer, a man with a slow voice and a steady pen who had handled simple estate things for us over the years. Tom is the kind of person who brings a box of tissues to an appointment and is not embarrassed by paperwork. In early November, I sat across from him in his office. His clock on the shelf ticked like everybody's does in a small room where decisions are made. We talked about practicalities and dignity. I told him what I wanted: clarity. I did not want my money to be something my children fought over after I was gone, and I did not want the quiet of my apartment to be punctured by requests that felt like demands. I told Tom I wanted the money to reflect what mattered to me now, not the accumulated ideas of obligation from decades past. Tom listened. He wrote things down. He did not argue. He had seen people do unexpected things, and he understood the difference between justice and retribution. On the morning I signed the papers, I remember the way the light fell through Tom's office window. It had that thin Ohio winter clarity. The air was hard and cold. I signed at 9:47 a.m. The pen felt ordinary and important at once. The documents moved my liquid assets, the checking accounts, the investment accounts that were actually not much by Wall Street standards, but everything to me, into an arrangement where I was the only person who could access them without specific consent. I had Tom draft the distribution in a way that matched my values: 65% to Jennifer, 35% to David. It was a choice that reflected what I had seen and felt for years, not a punishment. It was, if anything, an attempt to reward reciprocity. By 11:47 that morning, every dollar that could be put in that place was there. It felt decisive in a way that surprised me. I walked out of Tom's office with the echo of the ticking clock in my ears, and the city seemed both the same and different. There was nothing theatrical about it. There was a kind of quiet relief, a folding up of worry. I told myself nothing had changed except the paperwork. I also knew that paperwork can change people. A piece of paper isn't love, but it can shape how people behave when they think about your money. I made the call to David that afternoon for something ordinary. I wanted to come stay a week, 7 days. I wanted to see Chloe. I wanted to feel a child's hand on my knee again, to hear the rhythm of homework and dinner that had sounded like life in their house. It seemed small to me. I spoke as if it were small. "Hi, Mom," he said. He sounded as if he was in the middle of something. There was background noise I couldn't quite place. Maybe a TV, maybe furniture being moved. I thought I'd come up for a week, I said. Just a week. Chloe's birthday is next month and... There was a pause. A real pause. It landed like someone setting down a heavy object. Mom, he said finally, and his voice was careful. We're not running a charity here. Those 5 words, we're not running a charity here, are not dramatic in the way a shouted accusation is. They were dry, almost conversational, but in them I could hear an entire assessment. There it was, a family equation with me as a balance sheet line. He wasn't asking if I needed company. He wasn't asking if I wanted to be there. He was calculating cost. I was stunned in that single way you are when something you'd naively expected as given becomes clearly negotiable. I heard Jennifer's laugh from the next room of my memory and felt for an instant like someone had taken a photograph of me and mislabeled it. I could picture the table where Richard and I had done budgets, and the way we had decided to help because we loved them, not because we wanted a return. I took a breath. I answered him as plainly as I could. David, I said, this is not about money. I don't want you to feel like I'm asking for charity. I want 7 days with my family. His reply came quick. Mom, things are tight. You've got to understand. I stopped him then. Not because I was ashamed of my situation, but because there is a difference between discussing household constraints and making someone feel like they are on a ledger. David? I said, and I don't know what in my voice made him quiet. I signed some papers this morning. Tom helped me. The accounts are rearranged the way I want them. There was a sound at his end like a small intake of breath. What, Mom? What do you mean? I told him simply. The numbers. The percentages. I told him that Jennifer would be getting 65%. I told him David would have 35%. I told him it wasn't spite, and I told him it was a reflection of who came and who stayed over the years. There was a flurry of questions then. Was I all right? Was I competent? Were they needed? He asked those questions the way someone skims a manual, quickly, and with little pause. He wanted to know options, to know consequences. He asked if I was sure, and I told him yes. There is a point in grief when you measure yourself not by what others think, but by what your husband and your conscience would have advised. I pictured Richard's face, the small line at the corner of his mouth when he approved of something sensible. I felt steadier. What about Chloe? He asked finally, and there was a tone that suggested an attempt to move the conversation towards something softer. I'm asking to stay 1 week, I said. Not forever. 1 week. You can say no, but I want to be there. He answered then. He didn't say it to me in the gentle way children do when they test a boundary. He said it as if reading from a policy. We're not running a charity here, he repeated. It landed again with that same flatness, as if something I expected as a given was being returned to me as a cost. I told him I would think of other options. He wished me well. He put down the phone. When I sat back on my couch, the room seemed suddenly painted beige instead of the warm, comforting color I'd always called home. The silence felt loud. I folded my hands in my lap and thought of every time I had chosen to give, of every tuition check and small loan and casserole left on a doorstep. I thought of Jennifer, who had arrived with groceries, of Chloe's small feet on the rug, of the way Richard's hand had fit into mine and anchored me. I didn't call right back. I didn't want to make the decision while my throat was tight. I made tea. I warmed a slice of leftover pie. I opened the drawer where Richard kept his tools and ran my fingers across the old Phillips screwdriver he'd used for everything. Small domestic things hold grief in place sometimes, and when you touch them, you are reminded that life keeps its shape even when the center shifts. Later that day, my phone vibrated with a string of missed calls from David, a message from Stephanie, a voicemail that suggested calm concern. I listened. Mom, Stephanie said, call me when you can. We just want to make sure you're okay." Her voice was measured. She is good at keeping things presentable, at making hard things look like small, solvable problems. I appreciated the concern, and I also felt the sharp edge of being discussed instead of being asked. By evening, I had made a small decision. This is how things often go in a life. You measure the evidence. You consider the losses and the gains. You listen to the small counsel of your own heart, and you choose. I chose to protect the life I had left from becoming an endless ledger of requests, while still keeping the possibility of connection open. I told myself I would not let grief be used as a key to unlock access to me that had previously been taken for granted. I also told Tom what had happened. He listened and did not say I had made the wrong decision. He simply prepared the paperwork so that there would be no confusion, no emergency loophole. He told me gently that people react in different ways when they see things change. He reminded me of nothing legal and everything human, that my choices reflect my life, and my life deserved to be treated with dignity. That night I lay awake thinking of the things the money could not buy. I thought of conversation, of shared meals, of the quiet ritual of getting up together at 8 and studying over coffee, while a little hand still reached across for the cookie jar. I thought of the way Jennifer had stood at my door with groceries and no questions, the way she had changed a light bulb without making a fuss, the way she had learned Richard's coffee preference without being told. She had made room. David had taught me lessons about ambition and failure and recovery, but lately, his relationship with me had become measured in transactions. In the weeks that followed, there were more calls. There were texts at odd hours. "Are you sure you're okay?" "We want to help, Mom." There were messages that, read together, felt like negotiation. Stephanie called at one point to ask if I had considered an assisted living placement, her voice full of that neat, efficient compassion that often accompanies people who worry about appearances as much as outcomes. I thanked her and said I was thinking about things. Jennifer came over 2 weeks after I signed the papers. She sat at my kitchen table with a thermos of coffee and a scrapbook she had brought, full of pictures of the children. Chloe at 5, smiling with 2 missing teeth. A photograph of David with a graduation cap askew. Jennifer's presence is the kind of thing that fills a room in the softest way. She doesn't announce herself loudly. She simply arrives, and the furniture rearranges itself around her care. We did not speak about percentages or documents. We spoke about soup recipes and the best pants for cold Ohio days. At some point, she reached across and took my hand and said simply, "Mom, you're welcome here anytime." Her words were not dramatic. They were not a policy or a negotiation. They were an offering. I felt something in me uncoil. There is a strange economy to human lives that numbers cannot explain. You can account for money on a ledger, but you cannot ledger the weight of someone staying with you while you make tea. You cannot assign a value per phone call. You cannot finally make a percentage that accounts for the way a shoulder has steadied you. That morning, as I sat with Jennifer's hand in mine, I felt in my bones what I had suspected, that money only becomes meaningful when it is attached to the right kind of use. Not a punishment, not a reward in the vulgar sense, but an alignment of resources with love. Yet aligning resources has a cost that people sometimes overlook. The cost is the possibility of anger, the possibility of being judged, the possibility that someone will interpret your boundaries as an offense. I was afraid of that. I was also banked with a tired steadiness that comes with age and experience. I had been someone who taught for 30 years. I had comforted teenagers through heartbreak and watched them grow into parents. I knew the difference between a tantrum and a real need. I also knew when choices had to be made. That afternoon, I made a small list on a worn notebook. What mattered to me, what I could not bear to change, what I wanted my later years to look like. Food that tasted like home, Children who knew how to be present. A bedroom that faced the morning sun. Simple things, really. I kept the paper under a magnet on the fridge, and yet, as the days passed, David's calls increased. They were not all angry. Some were curious. Some were pointed. "Are you competent?" he asked more than once. "Do you really understand what you signed?" He called with questions that were legal in tone, but emotional in intent. He worried, or seemed to, about being cut out. He worried about what the text of a document might mean for his life. I answered patiently. I explained that I had thought about things for months. I explained that I did not want to leave confusion. I explained that redistributing assets did not change the fact that I loved him. It simply changed the terms under which he would come to me. When he came to the apartment that weekend, he stood by the doorway and looked around with that critical eye adults cultivate to judge whether homes measure up. He noticed the beige like someone making an inventory. He asked about the television, about whether the used furniture had been sold. He tried, I noticed, to make the small deficits into larger problems. We spoke for a long time in the living room. He, polite as always, expressed concern. He worried, I think, about how other people would view him. He worried about inheritance in a way that hinted at a worry about status. I tried to listen without becoming defensive. I told him about Richard, about the hospital bills, about the sale of the house. I told him I had not done this out of anger, and he listened with a look that shifted between comprehension and something like calculation. At one point, he reached into his jacket and took out a small envelope. Inside was a note. A short apology for not visiting as much, an acknowledgement that he had been distant. It felt as if a child had learned to say words grown-ups use and hoped they would be sufficient. I accepted the apology. I accepted the envelope. I also watched the way he straightened his coat and left the room, as if he had unfinished business on the porch of a house he did not plan to stay in. After he left, the apartment felt both relieved and raw. There was an odd emptiness to the air, as if the house had exhaled. I cleaned up the dishes and folded a throw. I called Jennifer and left a message. She called back within an hour. "Mom," she said, "do you want to come out for dinner on Sunday? Paul is making his stew. Chloe wants to set the table." I remember staring at my hands, the way they were aging, the faint dots of sunspots on the backs. I remembered Richard's laugh. I remembered teaching a classroom full of teenagers and how their attention could turn a whole day into something bright. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that." When Sunday came, their house smelled like onions and rosemary. Chloe ran to the door with a card she had made. The sofa in their living room was generous, and the beige of my apartment felt very far away. The kitchen had marble counters and a bowl of fresh fruit. Paul, Jennifer's husband, made tea in a way that seemed to say, "We live here and we make things together." They had cleared a small room with soft yellow paint and set out a quilt and a lamp. We ate. We laughed. Chloe asked me to play a game and I did, and for a little while, the ledger of gifts and percentages fell away like a jacket you take off after a long day. I felt seen in the way someone's work is seen when they have quietly done it well for years. That night, on the drive home, I thought about the choice ahead of me. I had done something that morning with Tom. I had set the account so that Jennifer would receive the larger share. I had done it not to punish, but to reflect a truth I had learned over years, that being present matters more than being enabled. I had decided awkwardly and bravely to reward presence. There are people who will tell you that money is only numbers and cannot buy you peace. They are right, and they are not. Money cannot sit with you in the cold and make you tea. Money cannot braid Chloe's hair or listen to a son confess an insecurity in a too quiet voice. But money can remove certain burdens. It can allow someone to care in a practical way. It can make it possible for a daughter to rearrange her life to open a spare room. it can also provoke a conversation you didn't ask for. When I tell you these things, I want you to hear two truths at once. I was not vindictive, and I was not naive. I had given to my children because I loved them. I had given because I thought it was part of parenting. But at 67, widowed, I wanted something I had not asked for often enough: to be seen. The week after that dinner, I rang David again. I asked once more if I might come for 7 days. He answered, but this time there was a different rhythm to the call. His voice was tight. "Mom," he said, "we're not running a charity here." It took me, oddly, less by the second time. I knew the cadence of an argument that begins with money. I knew how conversations slide from warmth into accounting. I told him as calmly as I could that I had moved the accounts that morning and that the papers were signed at 9:47 a.m. I told him the distribution. I told him I wanted a week, that I wanted to be part of family life for a little while, and that if he could not do that, I would look to other ways to spend my days with people who made a place for me. He asked then whether I had been coerced, whether someone had suggested this to me. I answered that I had made the choice, and that it reflected my values. I told him I had seen who had been present. I told him that sometimes the way people show up teaches you what they value. There was a silence on the phone. He told me he would think about it. He told me he would call back. When he did, the words were the same. "We're not running a charity here." The pause at the end of that sentence felt like a verdict. I held the phone for a moment after he hung up. The room around me, with its familiar lamps and the picture of Richard on the mantel, felt enormous. Then slowly, I put the phone down and called Jennifer. I told her everything. She did not gasp. She did not offer a reprimand. She offered a simple, steady invitation. "If you want to stay, Mom, you can stay as long as you like. We have a room painted yellow. There's a quilt in the closet. Chloe wants to know when you'll come." And there was my choice, sudden and clear, to stay attached to a pattern that had always defined my role, or to choose a life measured by mutual presence instead. It was not a dramatic epiphany. It was a quiet turning. I had to decide what dignity looked like in practice. That night I lay awake thinking of how often love is practiced in small, domestic ways. I thought of Richard's hands tightening the lid on a jar. I thought of the little routines, the way someone makes your tea the way you prefer it, that can matter more than accounts. I thought of the way Jennifer had quietly cared for me, and the way David's ambition had allowed him to move away and to fly. There is no moral shorthand that makes one choice clearly right for everyone. But for me, at that moment, the answer felt as clear as the morning light on the kitchen table. I slept a little. I woke earlier than usual and looked at the calendar. I made a list: what I would pack for a week, which photographs I wanted to take with me, what conversations I hoped to have. I kept the lists practical because practical things become the skeleton on which emotional lives hang. At 8 a.m., I called Tom to confirm the paperwork and to ask a question that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with dignity. What would happen if someone tried to pressure me? He advised me calmly, not with the sort of instructions that try to reshape a life, but with the small, steady reminders that people can be upset when boundaries change. At 9:47 a.m., as I had done once before, I looked at the clock and felt an odd sense of ceremony. Not because I wanted to celebrate control, but because I was marking a point of clarity. The day felt like a hinge. I had told myself I would not let anger or humiliation rule me, and yet when I dialed David's number and heard his voice again, I felt a heat rise that surprised me. Maybe that is how grief and dignity mix. They are not polite companions. They jostle for space. He answered, and the words came again, as if rehearsed. "We're not running a charity here." This time I told him what I had already done. I told him about the paper signed at 9:47. He was quiet. "Mom," he said finally. "Are you sure you're okay?" It is strange how the question of competence travels now, veiled as concern, used as a pressure point. I answered, "Yes, I'm as okay as I can be. I'm tired, but I'm clear." He didn't press further on that point. He asked if I intended to come that week. I told him I had been invited to stay with Jennifer, and that I was considering it. "Mom," he said softly, and for a second there was a softness that startled me. "If you go there, know that we'll be okay. We just wish you'd told us sooner." I thought of the many times in my life when I had been willing to accommodate the wishes of others. I thought of the slow accumulation of small favors that can become expectations. I thought of the Tuesday I had driven across town to pick up Chloe from school when Jennifer was double booked. Of the night I had sat up with David at 3 a.m. when a relationship ended. Of the casserole I had tucked in the oven when someone's pipes leaked. "David," I said into the silence, "I need a week with family. I asked you for 7 days. I'm not asking for handouts. I'm asking to be a mother in the ways that matter to me." There was a pause. Then, in a voice that sounded guarded, he said, "Okay, Mom. We'll see." When he hung up, the apartment felt both light and heavy. The kettle boiled on the stove and whistled as if to remind me that life keeps making sounds, regardless of whether we are ready for them. I packed a small bag. I folded a photograph of Richard into my wallet. I put the list I had written under the magnet on the fridge and covered it with a note for myself. Remember why. As I closed the apartment door behind me, I felt the weight of the moment. The papers were signed. The accounts were rearranged. I did not know what the next days would bring. I only knew I was choosing myself in a way that felt both brave and inevitable. I stepped into the cold Ohio air, the breath that makes your cheeks bright, and drove toward Jennifer's house with the radio low and the steering wheel warm beneath my hands. I pulled into Jennifer's driveway with the winter sun low, and the car feeling smaller than it had an hour before. The house looked like any other in the neighborhood. 2 stories, a small maple in the front yard, a wreath on the door. But to me it was an invitation I wasn't used to accepting. Jennifer met me at the threshold with a hug that smelled like lemon cleaner and flour. Chloe appeared behind her, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a paper heart she'd made in school. "Graham!" she shouted, and for a moment the kitchen filled with a sound I'd missed so much it felt like music. They had already cleared the spare room the way you clear space for a guest you hope will stay. The walls were painted a soft yellow. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the bed and a lamp with a shade that cast a kind, slow light. Jennifer showed me where the extra towel hooks were, where the little basket with tea would live, how to find the sugar. She had anticipated the small needs you do not ask for. A mug with my name on it, a jar of Richard's favorite biscuits, a cushion for the chair that used to pinch my back. We ate Paul's stew that night, thinly fragrant with rosemary, and the kind of slow-simmered warmth that makes conversation easier. Chloe talked about spelling tests and which hair ribbon she wanted for school picture day. Paul talked quietly about schoolwork and students, his voice the same steady thing that had always helped Jennifer sort through worry. They asked questions about my busier months with teaching, about Mr. Klein down the street who always mailed me postcards, the sort of small talk that binds people slowly. When the evening wound down and the house grew quiet, Chloe climbed onto my lap and said, "Graham, do you like my room?" Her voice was small and immediate. I told her it was the sunniest room I'd ever seen, and she beamed like she'd painted the sky. Later, when I lay beneath the quilt, I realized I had not thought of being this physically near someone in a long time. I fell asleep to the sound of footsteps above and the faint hum of a refrigerator that meant someone was near. That week opened like a gift I had stopped expecting. We invented routines almost immediately. Mornings began with us all in the kitchen, Jennifer with her thermos, Paul with the crossword, Chloe with her cereal poured into a bowl with cartoon whales. We had tea on the back porch when the day allowed, and sometimes we'd take a slow walk down the block where a neighbor waved, and the smallness of community made my chest unclench. I taught Chloe how to fold an origami swan from an old grocery list. She taught me how to take selfies on her tablet, an awkward, laughing exchange that left both of us with new pictures of ridiculous faces. Jennifer showed me where the vacuum cleaner was and how to set the dishwasher, half as instruction and half as an invitation to participate in the small domestic rituals that feel, in time, like presents. Paul and I found a quiet rhythm with chess. He'd set up the board between us on the living room table, and we'd play in the steady afternoons when the house was settled. He corrected my opening moves with gentle patience, and when I beat him once through a dumb, lucky checkmate, Chloe danced around the table like a tiny, delighted umpire. I loved that Paul took time to point out a strategy rather than rush to my rescue. There was dignity in the way he treated the game and in the way he treated me, as someone who still enjoyed learning. Jennifer and I spent evenings sitting at the kitchen table, sometimes talking and sometimes simply sharing the quiet work of life, sorting mail, folding laundry, arranging a vase of flowers. Her questions were practical and kind. "Do you want me to call Dr. Harris to transfer your prescriptions?" she'd ask. "Would you like me to pick up a new light bulb?" It was her way of offering, not remaking me. She did not hover. She respected the shape of my day and made small adjustments to include me. The week that had seemed so small in my mind stretched into something that felt more like a real season. I would help with Chloe's homework, stirring in occasional corrections and extra praise. We watched cartoons on Saturday mornings and argued playfully over whether the dog in the show was actually heroic. We planted a little pot with basil on the back steps and watered it across 3 mornings, proud each time a tiny leaf leaned into the sunlight. The house felt alive with ordinary things that had nothing to do with money. David called, of course. He called more than once. At first the conversations were strained. He asked for details of my day, and then, almost apologetically, shifted to the logistics of what the accounts meant. Occasionally he asked if I had eaten, if I was sleeping properly, if I'd spoken to a doctor. The worry in his voice sometimes felt real, and sometimes like a performance of concern. There were messages at odd hours. "Are you sure you're okay? We need to talk about these things." Once or twice there was a text that read like a negotiation. "Can we meet? I want to make sure Mom is protected." There were also messages from Stephanie, careful and composed, offering assistance. "If you need anything, please call us. We're here," she said more than once. Her voicemail sounded shiny and composed, as if she were presenting a polished version of worry. I appreciated it because it was offered, and I resented it a little because of the way it always arrived dressed up for the public eye. When Tom came by to check in, he's the sort who will drive across town with a thermos and a quiet face. He sat in the living room and listened. "People react," he said matter-of-factly, "when they see things change." He reminded me gently that my action had been clear and within my rights, and he said that families often test boundaries when a new configuration appears. He didn't make a spectacle of any of it. He folded himself into our dinner like a practicing hand and left afterward with a small wave. There were a few damper moments. Once, David surprised us with a visit. He stood in the doorway in his neat coat and looked around the way someone assesses a room for things they might not like. He made conversation. He asked how I was, and at one point he said something like, "We just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of." It is a phrase that sounds like care and reads, often, like accusation. I answered as I had before, with patience, with facts, with a calm that surprised me. "I'm here because I want to be," I said. "Not because I need a place to be taken care of, but because this is where I want to spend my time." He left with a bouquet of tulips and an awkward hug. Later, when he texted that night, "Hope you're resting. Call me when you can." I let the phone buzz. I answered in the morning with a brief note that read as both courteous and final. "Thank you. I appreciate you coming by. I'm comfortable here." Jennifer asked, quietly one morning as we stirred pancake batter, if I had thought about making the stay more permanent. She didn't put pressure on the question. She set it down like a plate and watched to see if I would take it. I looked at the steam from the pan and thought of the beige apartment with its 2 mugs in the sink and the folded coupons on the table. I thought of the quiet ledger of years and the way presents had slowly been counted out. I thought of Richard on the back porch and the small, steady way he had chosen his days. "Would you like to stay?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. We did not sign papers at the kitchen table. There was no ceremonial exchange. We made small, practical arrangements. The mail would be forwarded, the utilities adjusted. The spare room would become more mine than a temporary space. Jennifer said she would rearrange the closet, and Paul offered to fix a shelf that had always stuck. There was no rush. The decision was measured and kind, and it felt like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known how to form. When the season turned toward spring, the yellow in my room seemed to get brighter. Chloe's drawings migrated from the refrigerator to the frames in the hallway. I started a little notebook where I wrote recipes Jennifer taught me, and a list of the new places we might walk. I found myself humming again, a small tune I hadn't noticed I'd left behind. The grief of Richard's absence did not leave, but it found its place next to other things. It stopped being the only weather in the house. David's calls did not stop entirely. Sometimes they were practical. Sometimes they slipped into the old tenderness I remembered. He asked about a photo of Richard he found in a box. He said he wished things had been different, his words softer now. We spoke of memories, the time Richard fixed the toaster with duct tape and a patient twist of wire, the night we stayed up arguing about whether to repaint the hole. He apologized in ways that felt like practice. He offered invitations that felt like attempts to re-establish patterns. There were moments I felt compassion for him. The world demands things in different tones. Some people are told implicitly that time is their currency. Others are asked to trade it for money. I had watched David build a life where he traded himself for opportunity. I had also watched him be generous in ways that didn't register neatly on a bank statement. Too often, though, generosity had become an entry in a ledger for him, not a mode of being. His tone shifted a few months after I moved in. He expressed anger less and concern more. He worried aloud about the way other people might interpret the distribution of assets. He asked whether I had been coerced. He asked whether I was making decisions under duress. I understand now why those questions come. When the expected path is altered, people often search for an explanation that keeps their role intact. I answered each question with the steady truth. I told him about Tom, and about the timing, and about the weight that had sat in my chest for months. I told him that I had wanted a life in which small acts of caring mattered more than the balance of a bank statement. There were, of course, ripples beyond our family that I had not expected. A neighbor told me, in hushed admiration, that I had handled things with remarkable calm. A woman from my old church called to say she was glad I had chosen to be near family. Some old students sent notes saying how they remembered my classes and how my lectures had mattered in their lives. Those small messages felt like a patchwork of life that reminded me I had been part of many things, not just one ledger. Stephanie called a few times. Once she asked directly whether I had arranged for professional care should I need it. She spoke in a measured voice, and I answered that we had discussed options and that I appreciated her concern. She had her life, her roles, her responsibilities. Her worry felt as tidy as the envelopes she always used. I took no offense. Different people show their care in different shapes, and sometimes those shapes feel awkward from the inside, Tom continued to be steady. He came by with a cup of coffee on occasion and sat in the kitchen, reading the paper as if we were two people who had always shared the small habits of life. "You did what you had to do," he said once, his voice low. "You decided what mattered, and you acted on it. There is a grace in that." He didn't speak in absolutes. He didn't try to convince me of anything I hadn't already decided. He listened, which is often the most useful lawyering of all. There was, I will admit, a private pleasure in watching certain assumptions about me crumble. I had been a woman who gave, until the giving seemed to be the only thing that defined her. At times, people treated me as if I were an available resource rather than a person with needs. That changed when the accounts were rearranged, not because of spite, but because boundaries can reorder people's expectations more quickly than any lecture can. Once on a gray afternoon, David came by, and this time the visit felt different. He sat with Chloe on the floor and built a model airplane with her, the kind with little plastic wings that snap on. He laughed at her wrong answers and made exaggerated faces. He took a photo with his phone and sent it to me with a short message. "Thanks for coming up, Mom." It wasn't a public declaration. It wasn't a lawsuit or a demand for absolution. It was simply connection in a small, uneven way. As weeks became months, my life settled into a new ordinary. I knew where the good spoons were, how to cut a lemon for tea the way Jennifer liked, which mug was Paul's favorite. I had a place on the porch where morning fell in a patient rectangle, and where I would sit with a sweater over my knees and watch the neighborhood wake. There were times I taught Chloe how to whistle with 2 fingers, and times she taught me the names of characters in the books they read at school. I traded recipes with Jennifer and discussed the merits of various birdseed brands with a neighbor who liked to garden. The money remained a tool I had placed where I could see its effects. Jennifer's larger share, 65%, meant she had the practical freedom to rearrange her life to include me without shattering the household budget. David's 35% left him with a stake that was both real and fair, in my view, given the life each of them had built. The distribution was not meant to be punitive. It was meant to reflect what I had learned about care and presence. I never treated it as a moral scoreboard. It was rather a choice about the last seasons of my life. There were moments when I caught myself watching the way people behaved. I had conversations with friends about how we teach our children to show up. I wrote a note in my little notebook. Teach them to be present. It was short and blunt and felt like a motto that could be hung in a kitchen. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and Chloe was tucked in under her blanket, I would look at the photograph of Richard on the mantel and tell him, in my head, in the room where he used to sit, the small things I'd learned. I told him about the quilt, about the way Jennifer brewed the tea, about Paul's chest patients. I told him how often I had felt foolish and brave, and lately how often I felt simply seen. I am not an untroubled woman. Grief sits beside me like an old friend who still surprises me with his silence. There are days I miss Richard so fiercely it takes my breath, and there are days I miss the small rituals of the beige apartment. But there is also a steady peace that comes from choosing where your life will be lived and who will share it. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled things. I tell them no. My decisions were made with the imperfect human knowledge one carries at 67. I thought about Richard's tastes, about Jennifer's quiet habits, about David's restless heart. I thought about the small kindnesses that stitch a life together. A casserole when a drain bursts, a hand to hold at the hospital, someone showing up on an ordinary Wednesday to sweep a porch. I wanted the last part of my life to be measured by those things, not by the balance of a bank account. If you ask me what I would tell someone in a similar position, I will not offer legal advice. I will say this: look, truly look, at who has been there. Notice not only the grand gestures but the daily ones. The missed hours turned into presents. The phone calls that come without a reason. The person who knows how you like your coffee. Those small acts end up counting for more than you might expect. My days now are full of small domestic sacredness. I make a pot of tea and sit on the porch as the light warms the yellow paint. I braid Chloe's hair for school sometimes, and she refuses to be embarrassed. I bake a loaf of bread and share half with a neighbor who always returns it with an extra jar of jam. I teach at the community center on Tuesdays when they need someone to lead a writing group, and students arrive with stories that make my chest tight in the best way. David and I are not without work between us. There are awkward silences and conversations with no easy resolution. But there is also a way of being that is slower and more honest. He calls more often in a voice that no longer sounds like a ledger being balanced. Sometimes we do not speak of the accounts at all. We speak about the weather, about a photograph, about a small triumph at work. I take those moments as gifts and do not ask the past to be rewritten overnight. One late afternoon, when the light was the exact color of a cup of tea, I sat in my yellow room and opened a drawer where I keep small, useful things. A pair of reading glasses, a pack of envelopes, a photograph from our honeymoon. There was, folded inside the pack of envelopes, a note I had written to myself the week I left the beige apartment. It said, "Remember why." It was a small admonition and a compass at once. I have told you the details because they matter. The times, the figures, the way the pen felt in my hand at 9:47 a.m. Those things give shape to the choices we make. But if you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. Presence is its own kind of wealth. Money can buy convenience. It can free someone from certain burdens. But it cannot sit with you when you are afraid. It cannot braid your granddaughter's hair or laugh at a bad joke at the kitchen table. It cannot finally be the person who rearranges their life to include you in the small ways that make a life worth living. I get to decide where it goes. I chose the people who made room at their table. They sit beside me now as I write this. Jennifer with her steady hands, Paul with his chessboard, Chloe with a pencil in her hair. Richard's photograph looks on like a quiet witness. I do not pretend that everything is perfect. I do not pretend that everything is forgiven. But I know, in the slow, steady way that comes from living long enough to see the patterns, that I am at last being seen. If this story from Ohio touched you, if you've been the giver who wished to be received, or the one who has had to choose how to spend a later life, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more true stories like mine, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening to mine.